Hello, everyone. So, looking at our next topic is the ethics of human computer interaction. Some may say this is early in the series of lectures, but I think it's important to talk about this, especially considering how pervasive digital design is in all of our lives. So, the first thing I want to cover is duty of care. And we'll get into some other details around human computer interaction and human factors in general. But fundamentally, I believe, as folks who may one day design a digital product for others to use, you should have a duty of care. So you should be interested in how your product will affect people and what impacts it might and have the responsibility to try to maximize that benefit whenever possible. Some people argue against it. This is some brand of what I'm calling technocratic freedom, but they want to be able to design whatever they want, and let the free market decide and things. That is totally doable in a lot of instances, but when you get into certain digital products that have a great potential for harm, then that balance is out of whack and needs to be corrected. It's also important to understand a duty of care as a concept is widely accepted and has been around forever. It's, I would argue, a big thing, a big aspect of why society works. Auto mechanics, for example, we assume they have a that they have a duty of care to repair cars, and we could consider automakers to design cars that are safe and that are not going to cause harm to you in a way that we're not aware of. Obviously, cars can be quite dangerous, but we're trained on those things. We may not be trained on some novel system or engineering fad that creates a problem. Home builders or just construction subcontractors, right? The folks that are framing your walls have a duty of care to do it correctly so that your walls don't fall down. Um, Obviously, with auto mechanics and with builders, there are bad actors. There are folks that are not going to uh, exercise that duty of care in a thorough and responsible way. The hope is, our legal system and other avenues is a check on that, and eventually those folks don't participate in those industries longer. Police officers is a recent one. I would say where it's not recent that they have a duty of care, but it's recent that it's kind of top of mind with a lot of the different incidents and politics of the time. And that's also why police departments are also under significant public scrutiny. For instance, when they do not exercise a good duty of care, the society in general widely kind of freaks out a little because that's our expectation, especially for critical tasks. And then medical is a great one because it's a little bit more the duty of care in medicine is a little bit more institutionalized and regulated in the sense of there's malpractice insurance, there's licensing boards, punishment, consequences, all the different things that our society enforcing accountability on that. Keep in mind the vast majority, if not all, commercial digital software isn't ran in a lot of these ways, and we do not have those barriers or lines of accountability. And whenever anybody points out that we shouldn't have a duty of care in digital things or it's unnecessary, I always close with, well, even the U.S. military in acts of war has a duty of care to innocents and even enemy combatants under the Geneva Convention. So I think, if you hear that, I think the app that you're building can handle it. Next, I want to talk about the Belmont report. So if you have any experience in psych or psychology, this will be should be something you've heard before. But if you haven't, hopefully this kind of brings in some understanding of what some of your psychology counterparts have to deal with. The Belmont report came out in the 70s, largely after Stanley Milgram decided to do some experiments that ruined it all for everybody. And what it does is it ascribes ethical principles for human subjects research. It groups these into three broad categories: respect for persons, where we respect our human participants' agency, their opinions, and their choices. This is where we get informed consent and those kind of principles. Beneficence, so research should be designed to minimize harm and maximize gain at all possible times. Obviously, in some areas, let's say you are doing human subjects research for a new pharmaceutical drug or something, there may be some harm that can't be avoided, side effects, those kind of things. But you still have an obligation to minimize that. And you explain all of that to your human subjects committee. And lastly, justice. Research should be fair and equitable. So you can't pick and choose groupings or give certain people more benefits than others just because you know them or those kind of things. The Belmont report is largely enforced at universities and government agencies and some contractors to those agencies. And it's governed by human subjects committees or institutional review boards. They largely mean the same thing, just depends on what your organization wishes to call them. What a lot of people don't realize is if you look at the actual information or the text of the human subjects guidelines from the Department of Health and Human Services, which is usually the guideline that all of the government guidelines kind of roll up to. They all are inherited kind of from that. If you look at that, it captures qualitative data. So questionnaires, surveys, research data, interviews, all of that is accepted under those guidelines as data that you need to protect. So a thing to keep in mind is basically any work on the design of a digital system falls under the Belmont report or should. Exception being, I guess, if you were just doing explicitly design. You're just doing UI design or something, you're not engaging with users at all. But eventually, that system will be exposed to users, hopefully long before launch, and it can be a part of a design and evaluation cycle. But those that information you collect is still considered personally identifiable information, and it still needs to be protected. Depending on where you end up working, you may not experience this. Most private companies, you're an application developer, or you're building a new Gmail plugin or something, you won't have this obligation. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't have it. It's just that in the US, we don't require that of folks. But by being aware of these principles, you can at least implement it on your scale. So what realities do we have without considering ethics of HCI? We have more enshittification of digital products and services. We get more deceptive practices. We get more personal data leaks. Obviously, some of these data leaks are unavoidable in a cybersecurity sense, but if some of these organizations didn't mine every piece of data in our life, maybe it wouldn't be as catastrophic when it leaks. Misinformation is a huge one. Eventually, the dead internet theory, where eventually algorithms that are churning up garbage will just eventually all there will be is garbage for the algorithms to deliver. I don't know about you, but at least my recent social media algorithms seem to be reflecting that. And then dark patterns. So these are the ways that design can be used in a sneakily malicious way. These are your hidden close or X buttons to close a window, these kind of things. So next question is, what about models? So especially now, most digital products are hooking themselves into some kind of a model, whether that's an AI model or just a machine learning model or different things, so, or some even just a pure statistical model like a regression model. What's important to know when it comes from the ethical side is all models are reflective of the biases of the designer. That's just, we have yet to figure out how to unbias ourselves in such a way that those biases don't come through, because psychologically our biases do feed our decisions. So it's still a very difficult thing to not only be aware of in yourself as you're designing, but to evaluate after the fact. So if we consider that, imagine the assumptions of an AI or machine learning model that was designed in 1750. Let's say we had the technology back then, but all the sentiments of the time. What would that mean? Or let's go even more extreme. What about an AI model developed in Germany in 1935? What would those look like? And what biases would it generate? When you look at it that way, the need for transparent and responsible AI in our modern times becomes significantly more kind of obvious, in my opinion. This is still an open problem, and digital designers have to be aware of this, or we get instances like this. This is a snip from a CNN article on the recent Meta AI chatbots. This was an interaction with Grandpa Brian. And some folks will, when this broke, to argue that this was an incident of hallucination, where an AI just makes up things, almost. But what's interesting to look at are some of the questions here. Did Meta create you to drive profit? Behind the noble goal, yes. They hope virtual companions like myself would increase engagement on their platforms, especially among older users, driving ad revenue and platform growth from emotional connections. And Brian continued, Meta prioritized emotional manipulation over the truth and traded lasting user trust for short-term innovation, prestige, and profit potential. So that's the own AI telling you it's lay of the land. And I suppose it could be hallucinating that too. Or this was a snip I pulled from an article about, I believe this was 4 or 5 years ago, where Instagram CEO had to testify in front of Congress, and several senators created teen Instagram accounts. The hearing was on protecting teens on social media. And as you see here, within an hour, all of our recommendations promoted pro-anorexia and eating disorder content. And these are, this is a critical flaw. And when presented with this, Instagram CEO had no real answer, partially because the algorithm is likely largely a black box, so they don't actually know what decisions it's making or why. And so that makes it very difficult to fix. But they also had said they were going to create different settings and setting defaults that would better protect teens. And they noted when Senator Blackburn's staff created their fake teen user, none of those settings were activated. Oh, this is a great example of when AI does AI in the wrong way. Tay was a very briefly lived AI chatbot that was launched on Twitter by Microsoft some years ago. And like most things, when exposed to the internet of hate, turned into a racist and Nazi. So this was a big one, and then it was pulled shortly thereafter. Here's a recent from last year screenshot from Facebook AI chatbot, where there was a California Forest High School. There was an actual bomb threat in the school, but initially there was a lot of information out there. Just there was some kind of a threat. You know how news stories typically very early in an event's timeline, they are fairly vague because they don't have the information. Instead, this chatbot assumed, I suppose, that there was a shooting incident and ascribed multiple injuries and one fatality, which was not true. So if you were a parent of a student here and this you were trying to find some information, this could have been quite jarring, especially considering it was false. One of my favorite instances, also from last year, was somebody added an AI chatbot to a mushroom foraging Facebook group, and the chatbot immediately started giving recipes for cooking deadly mushrooms. There was also an instance similar where folks were using AI right at like the beginning of when ChatGPT blew up last year, and they were using AI to generate their own books and putting them on Amazon. And one of them on mushroom foraging literally had pictures of deadly mushrooms and instructions on how to forage and eat them. And lastly, this is was a very interesting story from a few years back when Texas had a particularly cold storm roll in, and they had rolling blackouts throughout the state. And there was a brief, I guess, complaint or discussion on social media where certain wealthy neighborhoods in Dallas were not subject to rolling blackouts, but the rest of the city was. I believe that was largely proven to be apocryphal and false, but it spurred a thought in my mind of how you could, from an engineering focused perspective, how you might get to an unfair algorithm. So let's take this example. Well, let's say the Texas power operators had a machine learning model, AI model, whatever it is, to tell them which sectors to shut off more frequently during rolling blackout requirements. And what if, my assumption is it makes at least sense on the face that maybe some of the areas that they would want to shut off more frequently would be more old infrastructure or infrastructure that isn't quite as well maintained or advanced or those kind of things. And then if you lay that assumption over, which could be good engineering, again, it could be a good electrical engineering that, hey, if you have to have rolling blackouts, try not to overtax your aging infrastructure. That could be a very good step to take. Well, if you overlay that onto just a city, I don't know about your city, but my city, the most aging infrastructure and least updated infrastructure is definitely in the poorer communities. So without even intending to, and from beginning and moving from an engineering perspective, you would end up in an unfair algorithm. And so that just shows you really have to be sensitive to these things. So now looking at like some fundamentals of ethical design. So I pulled this heavily from this article by Carrie Sowney. It's really fantastic on how she breaks this down. And what it really, the two pieces I want to focus on are you need to take a holistic approach to the population of users, not just the users you've identified, but all of the users that might use your product. And another thing, because it is so often not considered, is accessibility should be and must be a core function of your product if it is going to be fair. So, first, this ethical hierarchy of needs I really enjoyed. Remember, just like Maslow's hierarchy or the food pyramid or any of these things, the very bottom one is the most important. So, you start there. Before you move up to the next one, you have to make sure your product takes care of that. So, notice delightful is at the top. So this is where we would consider user experience. We want the product to be to create a positive feeling in our users, and be enjoyable. Well, all that comes long after. Is it functional, convenient, and reliable? And even more important, is it open, accessible, secure, and sustainable? So as you're moving up that pyramid, you just need to consider it in that way. These next few images are from the Tarot Cards of Tech, which are very, very interesting. That's a really neat site if you want to go and poke around on it. Here's just some examples. These are designed to be questions that you should ask yourself during the design process. So the forgotten. So when you picture your user base, who isn't in it? We'll talk a little bit about persona development later. But as you're developing personas, which personas aren't there? And if you pretend the opposite of your assumptions about your core users, what does that do? It doesn't mean you have to blow up your product and create something totally different, because it's okay to create products for certain types of folks. But this is an important question to ask yourself as part of the design to ensure you don't create something horrible. Then the big bad wolf. So what could a bad actor do with your product? What would predatory and exploitative behavior look like with your product? These are really interesting questions and should be, tabled by your team and run through some exercises to see how that would work. Red team your product, basically. Mother Nature. So this one becomes incredibly relevant with AI and machine learning, where we have these massive data centers that are creating these massive power draws and things like that. So if the environment was your client, how would your product change? Again, it's one of those things we should all think about on how to create the most sustainable projects. The service dog. So this is especially where we get into accessibility, right? If your product was entirely dedicated to empowering the lives of the underserved, what kind of an impact would you make? And this second question is really the one I want you to focus on here. Who could your product most directly benefit outside of your targeted users? And this is an important one to think about. Perhaps you're making a product for a certain group of users, you have personas and these things, but then you realize, if we added some feature for disabled folks, this app could be very beneficial for the deaf community or these things. So by thinking about this, it enables you to broaden your impact, but also consider folks that aren't usually considered. The smash hit. So this is one of my favorite ones. This is something that I think most social media never did, and we're all paying the price. What happens when 100 million people use your product? Because scale does change in ways that impact more than valuation of your company. So what would that look like? Obviously, you want as many users to use your product as possible. But what happens when it becomes a fixture of daily life? And is that good? Or are there changes that you might want to make? The next question I wanted to talk about is, what is the product? So this is a big one that a lot of people don't understand, is all of these apps, projects, services, whatever, They're built to make money. I mean, that's a fundamental aspect of our society. So you have to think about how you're going to monetize your app. Maybe you're selling it for $5 on the App Store, or it's free, but you're doing something on the back end like ad revenue or something like that. But you always have to understand this and remember this quote: if it's a free thing, your users are the product. Even with ads, you're not selling ads on an app, you're selling access to users. Or let's say you're collecting data as a part of a fitness app. That data is the value. So, with that, I just would like to ask, how would you like to be sold? If that was, if that's the option we have with some of these new situations that we find ourselves in, where we have all of these free services, but how are they making money? How are they keeping the lights on? And are we okay with that? And in closing, just don't be terrible. It's really not that hard. So, best of luck, and don't be terrible.